So let me tell you a little bit about the genesis of this particular story, because it had a very funny backstory, which I believe I mentioned in the introduction of the book, but I don't know how many of you read this in the book and how many of you just read a copy. What year was this? 91, I think it was. Esquire contacted me, and I do think that they were doing a series, if I remember.
I'm pretty sure they were, because when you pull it out, you see that there's every decade.
Okay, so then, and they had said to me, what was interesting is they had already chosen Macaulay Culkin, who was 10 years old at the time, and they asked me to do a profile of him, and they'd already done a photo shoot. So they had, spent a lot of money and pulled lots of strings, I'm sure, to get Macaulay Culkin's people to agree to having him profiled. To this day, I'm amazed that this was my reaction. I'd never written for Esquire before, so of course I was very flattered that they came to me. But I said, I'm just not interested in Macaulay Culkin. I mean, he's just he's this creature of Hollywood. He didn't even seem like a real person to me. I'm sure he is, but I'd also done a lot of celebrity profiles up to that point in my career, and I'd really had it. I mean, they are a species of writing that can be done well, but I'd done it enough that I really didn't want to do it anymore. So and particularly a kid where I knew that he would be completely managed, and chances are I would have had no time alone with him, just because that's the way it is. So I said, I have an idea. Instead of Macaulay Culkin, why don't I find a regular 10-year-old boy, just an average 10-year-old. So I'm more interested in the life of an average 10-year-old than I am in the life of, one in a million, literally, Macaulay Culkin. To my amazement, the editor said, sure, go ahead. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about here was the blessing and curse of the non-story. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little. Because this is the ultimate non-story. I mean, Macaulay Culkin, you may think, who cares about Macaulay Culkin? But a celebrity is there's always a built-in motivation for a reader, because there's the curiosity of what is this person like. So you remove that, and suddenly I was proposing this story which was far more difficult, far more complicated for me as a writer to sort out this fundamental question, which is, how can I convince a reader, first of all, what am I doing? What is the point of this story? Secondly, how do you convince a reader that a story about ordinariness, which is really what this was, is worth their time to read? And there's also another issue which is particularly challenging, and that is when you decide to do a story about something ordinary, how do you choose the example you're going to use? Because when you begin examining any particular example, none of them are ordinary. So you both are looking for something that can stand for a larger, whether it's a subculture or a socioeconomic slice of life, or in this case, an age and gender. But each 10-year-old kid is particular. So there's this real challenge in the story of how do you write a piece that both addresses the particularness of this boy and the iconicness of this boy. Because, of course, we can all stand for something bigger than ourselves, and yet we're all individuals. I have come up against this problem over and over again, and actually, when I was thinking of a subtitle for this book, I decided to sort of play off of that, and the subtitle is My Encounters with extraordinary people. Of course, most of the people I wrote about in this book are ordinary, but if any individual who you examine closely becomes, of course, three-dimensional and complicated. So it's a challenge, and even settling on one example of anything, you have to address the particularness of the example you've chosen. You know, and that becomes one of the trickiest things about doing a story that's about something ordinary. In any case, Esquire, you know, basically said to me, sure, go ahead, do this, whatever it is that you have in mind, to write about the life of a 10-year-old boy. Now, I didn't have kids at the time, but my guess was that 10 was a very interesting age, not that all ages aren't, but it was such a turning point between being a little kid and being a preteen. And, you know, it struck me that that was what was so interesting about that age, and it turned out to be, in fact, true, that what the story was about in one large part was about this funny moment where you have one foot in each world. You're still a little kid, but you're starting to think about life in a somewhat more mature way. But anyway, to peel back here, and you're welcome to interrupt me at any time, because I'm happy to do this as a conversation rather than just a presentation.
And if you do, ask for the mic, we'll turn it on so that you're heard. And say your names.
Yeah, actually, it'd be great. Actually, I was just thinking we could have a Jets and Sharks thing here with the two classes. Yeah. So I come up with this brilliant idea. I'm going to, instead of Macaulay Culkin, do a normal 10-year-old boy. And then there was this problem of how do you find a 10-year-old boy. I didn't want a kid in Manhattan because I felt that growing up in Manhattan is very unusual, very different from almost anywhere else in the country. So I thought, let me go to the suburbs to look for a kid who's having a life that is more typical. And actually, it's interesting that I use the word typical, because ordinary is a word that has some pejorative connotations. Typical is maybe more what I was really looking for, is a kid whose life was typical or, you know, conventional. It's just, when we say ordinary, it's got some meaning that I'm trying to get away from. So it was, of course, difficult to just figure out, how do I find a kid who's just a kid and not have it, you know, I had to first just go to friends and say, do you know any 10-year-old kids? Do you know any 10-year-old boys who don't live in the city? Which was tricky. But then additionally, it was tricky, and I know my students are working on their first essays, and the idea of approaching people and saying, can I just watch you live your life a little bit, is a very, oddly, far more complicated than saying to people, I want to watch you compete in the Winter Olympics. You know, people think like, well, what is it that you want to see me doing? So a lot of the time, what you're trying to do is convince people that what you want is for them to carry on as if you're not there. Now, I had, shortly before I started working on this piece, I had finished a book called Saturday Night. And it was a good training for this piece. What I did in that book was I wanted to try to create essentially a scrapbook of the American Saturday night. And in order to do that, I chose 18 quite different settings in which to spend Saturday night, and hope to have the Saturday night I was observing just sort of unfold as if I wasn't there. The journalist's fantasy that you could kind of be totally invisible, which of course you never are, but so I had practice with this tricky negotiation of saying, don't do anything special, just do what you're doing. Now, I did find a kid who was a friend of a friend of a friend, and fortunately his parents really did understand they were quite comfortable having me just kind of hang out. And that is, when people ask me, what do you want to do? I would say 99% of the time, thanks. My answer is always, I just want to hang out. So they said, sure, if Colin wants to. Colin, I think not quite knowing what it would entail, said sure. And, you know, this was a high stress moment, I will say here, just as a little additional backstory. I didn't really know what I was doing with the piece. And what I can tell you flat out, this kind of story is far, far, far more difficult than a news story, a story where the narrative is already there. Something happened. Something dramatic happened. A person is famous. You know, there's already a narrative. This was the inverse of that. Nothing was going to happen. This kid wasn't famous. That's precisely why I was writing about him. So, begin with, just, that's a tough story to do. Would you agree? I mean, I think that...
And most of their stories, these year-long pieces my class is doing,
are of that...
have a little bit of that nature to them.
Yeah.
It really is, there's like an area they're interested in that they're exploring, sometimes very widely.
Mm-hmm.
But 7 of them are really of that nature.
Well,
So
it's...
this is very interesting for me.
And, you know, I think one thing just to bear in mind is if you're working on a piece of that has any element of this and you're feeling challenged, you should expect that. It's hard every time. I mean, that is a tough story to do. Having people relax enough to carry on their life without being highly conscious of your presence is challenging. That's something that, you know, the only way that I find that you can accomplish it is just give yourself lots of time to hang out, and they get bored and they stop paying attention to you. But you know, I was trying to figure out, why did I actually make this choice instead of doing Macaulay Culkin? And to me, that was the narrative, at least in my mind, as I was working. And remember last week we were talking about how a lot of times when I'm working on a story, there's a word that resonates for me. And it may never appear in the story, but it informs the way I think about the story. And in this case, you know, I really needed to figure out in my own mind, why did I choose, why is this more interesting to me than Macaulay Culkin? Is it the idea as, I mean, it was more interesting for many reasons, one of which is my conviction that the things that we think we understand very well, that are right next to us, that are right in plain sight, are often the things that, if you examine them a little more closely, are the most surprising. I thought, well, I know what 10-year-old boys are like, and then I thought, well, no, I don't. I don't know at all really what a 10-year-old boy is like, or what he thinks about, or what's interesting to him, or what he even sounds like. So that was the kind of anchor that I hung on to while I was doing this, which was the feeling that I was actually entering a very exotic world, very far more exotic than it would have seemed, because what could seem more ordinary than just some kid in New Jersey. And I liked that reversal, the funny surprise of thinking that this thing that seems so normal and dismissible was actually really full of surprise and wonder and new information. It was new for me. How I was going to write it was still a huge challenge, but I didn't have any idea of how I was going to write it. I just began by saying, let me spend as much time with you as I can. And I thought, I'm just going to go to school with him. I'm going to hang out with him after school. And of course, the horror was that they did, yeah. Now, I don't know if they would still do that. I mean, this was a small private school, and they were fine. I mean, did my homework in advance and made sure that they were fine and they didn't mind. I showed up on the first day and I could tell that Colin suddenly was having second thoughts, like, who is this grown-up? And do I have to talk to her? And he got shy. And I thought, oh my God, I am screwed, totally screwed. The other fact that was underlying my anxiety was that A, I'd never written for Esquire before, B, they were holding this space open in the magazine and all the rest of the pages had already gone to press. And they had left these pages open and they had said, it's going to be the cover story. So I would say I was a little stressed, a little bit stressed. So when I showed up and, first of all, I thought, I don't know if I've chosen the right kid, but this is the kid that I've chosen. And then he wouldn't even talk to me. And and plus, what is the story that I'm doing anyway? Why am I doing this? Is it too late to call Macaulay Culkin? And one feature of doing the kinds of stories I do is that there is always this moment for me, sometimes throughout the entire piece, where I am thinking, why would I want to write this and why would anyone want to read it? And that's an uncomfortable part of doing any kind of writing that is not news reporting, I think. And it's probably useful just to prepare yourself for that, and so you're not shocked each time you feel it. Because I certainly do. I mean, almost every story, as I'm working on it, I think, now, why would anyone care about this? And then the thing that sort of buoys me up and sort of pushes me along is that I'm actually really interested in it. And that is finally the thing that I really hang on to, which is I'm interested. And I become convinced, for better or worse, whether it seems completely narcissistic or not, that my belief that this is interesting is, I can convey that to a reader and that they will then become interested, and that it is all about the excitement I feel about learning something new. And I think that has to be authentic. I think you can't pretend that. So if you're doing an assignment that's not your choice and you think, well, how could I possibly apply that same rule of thumb to an assignment? Somewhere in each assignment, you have to be able to find the thing that's compelling. Or maybe it's just what compels you is the idea that you can make this interesting. You can tell a story that's interesting, even if it's something you were assigned to do and you don't bring to it this great passion and enthusiasm. I believe you absolutely have to find in every story a well that you can draw from that's about your desire to be a storyteller. And I just don't think there is any way that you can possibly, that is not sufficient, but it's absolutely necessary. You've got to feel caught up in this desire to tell this story. And if it's an assignment, well, so find a way that you feel compelled to tell that story, even if it wasn't a story that you set out to do. I'll also say, if you don't feel that passion about storytelling, then if you've chosen this as a career, you're going to probably come up against some troubles, because I think it's really necessary. Nevertheless, I showed up in New Jersey, panicked, thinking I have no idea what this story's about. Why did I do this? This kid won't talk to me. I went to school with him. I sat there in the corner and, sitting in one of those little teeny 5th grade seats, thinking I can't even fit, and the kids are all eyeing me. Who is this? Colin, of course, shunning me because it was completely embarrassing. And I just sat there thinking, I'm so screwed. I can't believe this. Such a nightmare. I think on the third day, Colin finally took some pity on me, or he just was used to me at that point. And he said to me after school, do you want to come over and see my room? And I thought, oh my God, thank God, this has finally happened. The idea that he suddenly found it interesting to try to show me his life. I think there's a huge value.
Do you think his mom told him to invite you?
No, I think his parents were completely, they just said, you know, we're happy to let you do it, you do your thing, and which was ideal because I had talked to one other boy whose parents I felt were very interested, very, you know, I felt like they were already calling an agent, you know, I thought, I don't want to do this. They were so eager that it seemed like not a good direction for this story. And the kid was, the funny thing is the kid's eagerness now I look at and think really more typically a 10-year-old kid would sort of be very nonchalant and blow you off. And that was more typical. This kid who got really excited and really, you know, thought this was like thrilling, I thought this isn't really typical. I realized that more after the fact. The main reason I steered away from that other kid is his parents felt like stage parents to me, and I thought I don't want to get involved with that. So I do think that Colin's parents just sort of let us be, which was fabulous. There's a huge benefit when you're working on a piece to spend a lot of time not asking questions. Now, this may run counter to everything you learn, certainly in journalism school, but usually in the beginning, I have no idea yet what I want to know. I really want to observe. And also, conveniently, it lets people start getting used to you and begin, their self-consciousness, I think, begins to dissipate. I don't come in with a million questions. And there have been many times where I think people who I've been writing about are kind of surprised and they're wondering, when am I going to start asking questions? Now, if I have a limited amount of time, of course I have to start engaging immediately. But if I have a little bit more time, I almost always begin very, very, very quietly. And I'm not a quiet person. It's just that I'm usually just trying to get my bearings. I, some years ago, did a story about a life in a trailer park. And again, this was one of these stories where I think, what am I doing? What was this story about? But I showed up at the trailer park, and for the first day or two, I just sat in the office sort of watching people in and out and watching the manager. You know, I'm sure I asked her a few questions, but basically I didn't. Most of the time I sat there or I wandered around. Finally, at one point, she said to me, "You're a quiet little thing, aren't you?" And I thought, well, that'll be the first and last time in my life that I'll be referred to as quiet. But I also felt that it began to make her, draw her out almost accidentally. That she began talking to me and telling me about what was going on, almost, again, out of a sense of, you know, not pity, but just accommodation. Like, here I was sitting there, and she'd say, "You okay?" And I'd say, "Yeah, no, I'm fine." And then, you know, someone would come in and out, and she'd say to me, "Oh, God, that guy is so far behind on his rent." And slowly, the story, you know, to me really emerged. But also, I didn't know what questions I had. So I didn't come with a long list of questions. I'm also a great believer that you find your style, and there are for other people, having the list of questions is comfortable. For me, it's not. I'd rather come and see what's going on and then begin asking questions. So in the case of Colin, it was very much, it was really important to begin to feel that he was relating to me and sort of forgetting that not totally, but being less conscious of the fact that I was a writer, that I was an adult, that he was being observed, and it began to feel more natural. And I think the ultimate, and it's part of the reason I put it in the lead, was one day when I was playing with him and his friend and they started shooting dog food at me, and I thought, I've kind of passed into this other relationship with him where it's totally natural, and he's sort of forgotten that I'm there observing him, and he's sort of taken me in, and not even really as an adult, as something else, some hybrid, you know, a 10-year-old boy, girl who had a driver's license. You know, I think I was this creation that was new and rarely encountered. A non-authority figure adult who just thought whatever he wanted to do was fun. So it was, I'm sure for him, kind of fabulous. You know, he'd say, let's go, like, to the candy store. And I'd say, sure, I've got a car, let's go. You know, and so this is, what could be better? So I want you guys to interrupt and ask questions, and I'm going to keep going. And just tell you a little bit about the process, which is I had about 2 weeks to report the story. So I spent that time largely with Colin, and then as you can see, I began thinking, right, I want to ground this also in some reported information about what is 10-year-old psychology, what is the nature of the life of a boy in the United States in this day and age. As you know, you certainly noticed a certain amount of reporting about Nintendo, about psychologists and their observation of what happens when you're 10. I did a lot of reading that didn't show up in the piece, but I needed to feel grounded in fact. It wasn't just pure observation. It wasn't just, and then Colin did this, and then he did that. I did reporting about the town he lived in. I felt, you know, I wanted some sense based in fact of what kind of place this was, socioeconomically, you know, whether I might find something in the history of the town that would be interesting or useful. It turned out I didn't really, but I wanted to have a really strong sense of where he lived and how closely it could stand in for a fairly typical American suburb. Lots and lots of reporting that didn't end up in the story. And I would say 100% of the time when I write, there's probably close to a 2-to-1 ratio on the reporting, would you say, typically, of what shows up in the piece and what doesn't. And I never look at that as wasted.
One being the smaller amount showing up.
Or,
The other way.
you know, I've never sat down and really looked, but I would certainly say you leave a lot on the cutting room floor. And I feel like you need always to be writing from a sense of confidence in what you know. In order to write about this boy, I felt it was important that I knew some background about the town, some background about the school, some psychology about 10-year-old boys, some sociology about, you know, Nintendo. I mean, I felt like I needed to know all of that so that when I made a statement, it was coming very comfortably out of something I knew. And that's where, you know, we've talked a little bit about voice. I think voice so often emerges from really truly knowing.
Authority.
Yeah. And I don't think the authority can ever come from a superficial, you know, skimming of something. I think what you want is to feel like you really know the world that you're describing, that you could tell the story without notes, you know, with the exception of a few figures that you might have to look up, from knowing it. Sure? Are we indeed recording this?
Yeah, we
Oh,
are.
good, good, okay.
We're going to have a little filmette.
Hi, Diane. No.
Say your last name, too. You don't do that. I'm Diane.
The one and only.
Is it on? Okay, go.
I'm Diane Nora. I was wondering what the total timeline you spent with him was. You said day 3 he started really opening up. Were you there?
It spanned 2 weeks, and that was partly because that was the amount of time I was given because the story was due. I had to do the reporting and the writing in about 3.5 weeks.
Wow.
So it was really tight. And I began, I think it was probably a Monday, and I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly, but I did that school week with him, saw him a little bit on the weekend, and then I did a few days into the next week. I don't think I did the entire second week because I then started getting worried about the writing. And that's a pretty short turnaround, I would say. It was extremely short, and so
How many words is it? It's a long piece.
it's pretty long. Yeah, I don't know how long. It's maybe
Anybody do words?
9 pages, single space. So
what's so 5,000 words maybe, something like that, or maybe even a touch more. So that was pretty tight.
6,300.
Yeah. But you know, I think I've done pieces where, I mean, the amount of time you spend is an elastic issue because I've done stories where I had a much shorter amount of time. You report in a sort of a different way, and you know, I mean, I've done stories that spanned months where I spent time with people over the course of a couple of months, and that, you know, it's very different. But I've definitely done stories where I was given an extremely short amount of time. In one case, I did a profile of an artist named Thomas Kincaid, and I was given 1 hour to spend with him. I did a lot of other reporting. I went to the galleries that he owned. I spent, you know, I did a lot of other reporting, but I was given 1 hour, and literally, where they said 1 hour. And he gave me a little bit of extra time, but it was otherwise 1 hour. Now, I found it interesting and actually part of the story about how controlling he was, that he only allowed me 1 hour. So I didn't even mind it. It's just that the minute I walked in, I thought, okay, 59 minutes, okay, 58 minutes. You know, I felt like I had to be, you know, having supervision, you know, really paying attention, but I felt also that it was almost suited the whole point of the story, was that he had managed his persona so completely that 1 hour was all he allotted for a profile for the New Yorker. So, you know, you work with what you're given, so. Yep. But how's my hair look? You know, I didn't even fluff.
You can see yourself behind. You look really good.
Okay, all right, good.
I'm going to have to go to a meeting, but Rachel is our hostess, so she will take care of it.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right, good, good. Will you come back or no?
At what time do you finish?
You've got my coat.
Oops.
Very clever, very clever. I have witnesses. We're done at 2:20, so, okay, good. And we'll take a break at some point. I don't have a watch on, so who is usually my break caller? Okay, so we'll keep going and then we'll take a little break.
Hi, my name is Vivek Namanam. I was wondering about the other kids in the story.
Mm-hmm.
They behave exactly like kids do the whole time in the arcade, for example, with the teenagers and his friend. And I was wondering how your presence didn't interfere with that, because it's one thing to get Colin to be comfortable with you, but
that's a good question. I mean, they ignored me, like those teenagers who were being kind of bratty. I think there are a few reasons for that. One is a very practical one, which is I'm small. I don't look, I wasn't dressed in a parental way. I didn't try to dress like a 10-year-old, but maybe they ignored me or thought I was a bigger teenager. I mean, this was like, how many years ago? I looked younger. But I think that they ignored me and they simply interacted with him, and I was kind of hanging back enough that I wasn't like, if I were with my son, I would be much more clearly present as a parent, I think. As far as his friend, Japheth, who we spent a lot of time with, I mean, the kids in school ignored me. I mean, they were in school, they were in class, there's a teacher there anyway, so having another adult, they didn't really pay that much attention to me. With Japheth, fortunately, he was this very lively, chatty kid, and he was showing off more than Colin. But I could factor that in, and it actually worked well. If he had a friend who was really shy and it became awkward, it would have been trickier. It's amazing how people will ignore you if they don't know who you are and you're not being very deliberately present. They just kind of go about their business. Sometimes it's kind of amazing. I mean, I did a story where I traveled with a gospel group down south for a couple of weeks, and they were African American, and every single person in every setting we were in was African American, and I thought everybody would focus on me, like, what's this white girl doing here? And people just kind of went about their business. I think they just thought, well, whatever, which is it's great. I mean, of course, ideally, it's what you want, especially if, as I do, if you like to write about cultures not your own, so that you're very often the odd one out. And I think people notice me, but somehow they're busy living their life. They don't pay that much attention. It's kind of funny. Gar, I think you had a question, right? Okay.
Yeah, my name is Gar Adams. I'm curious, you said in this piece, I mean, the very short turnaround, you had about a week and a half with him, and then you started writing. When you have a little bit longer of a time for a piece like this, or generally, do you always consciously stop, interviewing and watching and then start writing, or is there some crossover where you would potentially actually start writing the piece before you've stopped being with the subject?
Yeah, I really prefer doing all my reporting, stop, think it through, go over my notes, process them once, twice, as many, type them up, as I think I was saying to you guys, type them up, go through highlighting, printing out my notes, which I recommend, just as far as purely a practical tip. I really urge you to print out your notes so you can see a lot of them all at once. Highlight what I think will be useful, organize them a little. In the meantime, I'm thinking and thinking. If in the course of reporting, or rather writing, I suddenly see, I didn't find out X, I can go back and do that. But to me, I feel that I don't know what I am going to say till I'm done doing all of the learning I'm going to do. And I know some people start writing. I can't imagine it. I can't even imagine writing a lead until I finished entirely, so that I'm sitting there processing it. And I keep doing this hand gesture because I feel like there's a way that it's just kind of percolating in your head, and you should spend that time before you actually write. I think if you're still out there, you know, it's such a reverse. You're out there, it's a very external process where you're gathering information. The writing is so much more internal, and you're crafting this object almost. For me, the overlap is jarring. You know, I want to be done, and I want to be settled and in that frame of mind of processing. What did I see? Why do I want to tell this story? What really struck me about being 10? What do I feel about what I've just done for 2 weeks? And this piece, obviously, and I'm waiting for someone to ask me about the lead, just to drop a hint. You know, I think that it was very much an emotional story for me. And I needed that time where I wasn't with him anymore to think about how I felt about what I just observed, and to find the emotional core of the experience for me. And it's an important part of writing for me, to just spend that time. Why do I do what I do? Why do I write the way I write? Why did I choose this subject? Where's the emotional heart of this story? And that truly informs how I write. And I'm not sure I could begin writing without that process. Question?
Yeah, hi, I'm Joe Weston. And maybe you could read the lead, I don't know, for our TV viewers back home, just so
Sure.
they don't feel left out. But yeah, I was actually really interested in the process that you came to determining how to write that lead, because it is separate from the actual story, which is sort of your experiences with Colin. And it almost seems like you guys are writing it together. That's the way I put it, because it seems like, you know, it's very like innocent and childlike, but it's also like, I don't even know really, but I was very interested in it.
Why don't I read it, and then I'll tell you a little bit about it, and also confess to a little bit about it. So, okay, The American Man, age 10. If Colin Duffy and I were to get married, we would have matching superhero notebooks. We would wear shorts, big sneakers, and long, baggy t-shirts depicting famous athletes every single day, even in the winter. We would sleep in our clothes. We would both be good at Nintendo Street Fighter 2, but Colin would be better than me. We would have some homework, but it would never be too hard, and we would have always just finished it. We would eat pizza and candy for all of our meals. We wouldn't have sex, but we would have crushes on each other, and magically babies would appear in our home. We would win the lottery and then buy land in Wyoming, where we would have one of every kind of cute animal. All the while, Colin would be working in law enforcement, probably the FBI. Our favorite movie star, Morgan Freeman, would visit us occasionally. We would listen to the same Eurythmics song, Here Comes the Rain Again, over and over again, and watch 2 hours of television every Friday night. We would both be good at football, have best friends, and know how to drive. We would cure AIDS and the garbage problem and everything that hurts animals. We would hang out a lot with Colin's dad. For fun, we would load a slingshot with dog food and shoot it at my butt. We would have a very good life. writing a lead. The confession that I will make to begin with is, and this is probably not what you want to hear, but to some degree, I can't really explain leads. They are 90% inspiration and 10% utility. So while I would like to give a really clear explanation of how I end up with a lead, part of it I can't explain. I'll spend a lot of time throwing different stuff down, and it's not right, and it's not right, and then suddenly it just emerges, and it's clearly right. This particular lead, first of all, I like a preamble lead, if it's appropriate. And this is kind of what I think of this as being. It's almost like the preamble to the story. I liked conjuring that funny mixture of childlike and mature thinking, which is really what the piece goes back to repeatedly, that funny moment in development where you're a kid, but you're starting to think much more like a teenager, and that it's really about being on that cusp, and trying in his voice sort of describing the way he would look at the world, that this would be the perfect outcome of his life, because of course he imagined that this was who he would be forever. Somebody who would hang out with his dad, sure, he wanted to have kids, but of course they would just be there. You wouldn't do anything weird like have sex to have them. That it was kind of everything that he imagined a perfect life would be. Now, why would I construe it as a marriage? I mean, part of that was just it just struck me. It was something that when I started writing it, I thought it was so funny and crazy that I stuck with it. Part of it was, I think, I had really sort of fallen in love with him. And I don't mean that in some weird, creepy way, but I was just he was a really great kid, and I just got sort of drawn into his worldview. I mean, I just spent 2 weeks with a 10-year-old, and not as a babysitter or a parent, but just trying to live his life. And I felt completely drawn into this crazy way of looking at the world. Of course, not where I wasn't aware of it, but just, it was a very romantic thing to imagine that you could really look at the world this way, that it would be this dreamy, totally unrealistic world that you would inhabit, that, full of all the aspirations of a 10-year-old. I didn't put it in the voice of as if I were a 10-year-old, because I thought, no, I'm not him. I'm not going to pretend to be him. And I'm not going to pretend to be a 10-year-old. It was definitely risky and kind of out there to say we were going to be married, and I'm actually amazed that it passed muster. But nobody has ever said to me, "Ooh, that's so creepy." I don't think it's got creepiness. I think it's about falling in love with looking at the world that way because of the real charm and enchantment of still being full of wonder and being able to imagine a world where the biggest excitement was to shoot dog food at someone's butt. I mean, it was so wonderful to imagine that would be the way you could look at the world. And I'm a girl and he was a boy, so it seemed, and did I sit down and think, okay, I wonder if I should write that we're going to be married? No. Purely, totally kind of some wacky thing where I sat down and started writing in this voice of I'm buying into his worldview. and it came out in that form. I wish I could tell you more, like mechanically, how that happened, and I really wish I could. I can't. I have at times noticed that I write leads often channeling the voice of who I'm writing about. Not so that I'm pretending to be them, but adopting, at least in the lead, a voice informed by who they are. And then I step back. And I almost feel that in this case, it's as if a camera is pulling back, and I'm saying, okay, now I'm the writer again. And I'm going to tell you I'm going to write about this boy. I'm able to still keep this distance, and I'm not going to write the piece as if I'm him, though it gave me the freedom then to move back and forth in the piece between adopting his syntax and his language and his way of describing things, and then stepping back and being the writer. And in particular, you know, there's a point where I just use complete jargon, psychological jargon, you know, in the ultimate sort of repertorial voice. So throughout the piece, I moved back and forth between, you know, the writer, the voice of a 10-year-old, and then, you know, and then a more moderate, you know, between those two, of observing him and being part of his world. It's a tricky lead, and I will say most of the time when I look back at leads, I can't quite tell you how I got to it. I know that I throw around a bunch of different ways to begin, and it's pure intuitive. You know, if you write a lead and you can't think of the next sentence, it's probably not the right lead. You know, if it should feel like you stepped onto a moving train and you see where it's going. And in this case, I wrote that initial paragraph, and then it felt absolutely natural that I would then step back and say, okay, here's Colin, here's where he lives, here's, now I never write the paragraph saying, I've been given an assignment to write about a 10-year-old boy, but I think there's a point where I have set you up to understand that you're stepping into his world. Leads are really challenging. I also happen to think they're really important. I think in terms of just your own work on a lead, try a lot of different leads. Be willing to be a little oblique. Don't worry about starting with a little detail. You don't have to tell the whole story in the first sentence, is what I'm trying to say. That it can be a detail that's just totally captivating or odd, or it's just a come on where the reader will think, what? You know, and want to read more, because that's the point of a lead, really. It's supposed to be doing something, which is getting people hooked on the story. So the best advice I can give you is don't try to tell the whole story in the first sentence. And you don't even have to tell the whole story in the second or the third or the fourth. I mean, at the end of that first paragraph, you have an idea that this is about a kid's worldview, right? I mean, would you say that that's what it conveys to you without ever saying it? But I still haven't set up the story of, I am now going to tell you the story of Colin Duffy. Other times you can start a story with an absolutely declarative description, something, you know, very plain spoken. So, you know, I don't think there's one way to start a story, any particular story. I think there are a lot of different leads. But I encourage you not to be afraid to try a lead that is coming at the story sideways. Go ahead. Is the mic somewhere?
My name is Jenna Spitz. I'm interested if in the course of spending time with Colin, he took interest in you as you were taking interest in him. You wrote about how he asked you if you wanted children, and you said girls. And I was wondering if you had to maintain a kind of barrier, and where you drew that line in order to not provide another influence in how he was acting with you, or if you just let it all go.
This is a question that comes up always, and with a child more than in almost any other setting. Many times people are curious about you, especially the more time you spend together, the more it's a natural part of your conversation. They're going to say, you know, what do? You have kids. It's just, it comes up. I don't have a policy where I think, you know, I'm just going to say, geez, I don't want to talk about that. I don't try to belabor the point. You know, I don't want to track off too much. But I also feel that it's fair to say, if someone says, you know, what does your husband do, as he asks me, tell him. I mean, I don't think it interferes, and I think it's fair in a sort of ethical sense that you're asking them about their life and you're going to publish it. If they ask you about yours, it seems fair in return to tell them, and also give them a little sense of who you are and where you're coming from. I think, you know, if you spend too much time or make that too much of a focus, first of all, it's too much time. And secondly, it can start blurring the very tricky issue of, are you friends or are you a writer and a subject? And it's funny, it seems like that wouldn't be the case, but the more you try to make it feel like it's an even balance, the more the person is going to be diluted slightly, because it starts seeming like a friendship. So in the interest of honesty, it's not a friendship. I think it's very fair to feel you can answer questions or, you know, share a little bit about who you are. But if you go too far down that route, it starts being confusing. And there's a point where you will say to the person, I'm done with my reporting now. I'm going to go home and write about you. And that's a very jarring moment. Now with Colin, it was really difficult for me because he said to me on the last Friday I was there, you know, are you going to come over tomorrow? And I said, no. I thought, no, I'm on a deadline. Are you kidding? I mean, but I suddenly thought, well, I've hung out with him for 2 weeks. You know, he's not there thinking constantly, gee, you know, that's off the record. She's a reporter. I mean, you know, I did my job of connecting with him and beginning to feel that I was seeing him in his most natural behavior. And yet, at the end of that process, you know, I'm making this sound very harsh, but the reality is I was then not coming over to his house every day. For a kid, that feels crummy. For an adult, they're more, you know, most adults are quite aware of the point at which you're going to leave and go do your writing. If you're a certain kind of writer, though, a certain kind of reporter, as I am, I almost always make some kind of an emotional connection with the person, and it is difficult to then say, I'm done now, I'm going to go write about you, and there's no continuation of this relationship. you know, the fact is most of the people I write about, I would have no occasion to be friends with, so it's not as if we would continue a relationship. There wouldn't be any natural way that would happen. And I did become friends with one person I wrote about, but generally it just doesn't happen. I mean, our worlds have no overlap. And there are warm feelings, but we're not going to hang out. And in this case, I was very aware of what an moral and ethical challenge it is to be a writer, to be in people's lives, and then step back from them. And sometimes you have a relationship with your subjects that's like a therapist. They're doing a lot of talking, you're doing a lot of listening. And people will tell you, people will talk very openly. I mean, who doesn't love having a listener? You know, it's a very, very seductive. But your therapist doesn't go and then write about you. So it is a little bit harder in the case of a writer when you're doing a news story, when you're writing about a celebrity, and they are all along quite aware of the trade that is taking place. That's one thing. When you're writing about an ordinary person who stands to gain nothing by you writing about them, who isn't as familiar with the process, and who is completely seduced by the experience of being listened to, you know, you have to make peace with yourself. I mean, people tell you, I mean, that's just the way it is. I mean, I just did a story where in the course of the reporting, a guy who I was spending some of the time with, we had to drive somewhere, and we were in the car together for probably 6 hours altogether. Well, we weren't talking about the subject of the story the whole time. We were talking about everything. I know a lot about his children at this point. And it was really interesting. We were just talking like two people, like you're sitting on an airplane and you're bored and you're talking to the person next to you. So now the story wasn't the least bit adversarial, so I didn't think later, oh God, you know, how do I deal with this? But you will come up against this all the time. And you have to prepare for the uncomfortable moment when you're stepping away and the person might be offended, they might be angry, they might feel like you suckered them almost into thinking they were your friend. And if you're going to write something that's not flattering, you know, that's very uncomfortable. You know, even doing physical descriptions of people who you've spent a lot of time with and you're trying to be frank about what they look like, it's not so comfortable. Part of the reason I stopped being an investigative reporter is that I just didn't feel that I was cut out for that kind of adversarial writing. And now, obviously, if you're doing investigative reporting, you're mostly writing about creepy people, and you're perfectly happy to write about how creepy they are. But it is not comfortable, and I don't think it ever is. And at the same time, you have to try to write the best piece you can write and not be constantly thinking, I hope they like it, I hope they like it. Because if you do, you're going to be completely flummoxed. You're really going to have a hard time writing. You know, that's just you know, it's an ongoing issue in journalism, in nonfiction writing. It's, you know, the documentary eye. And what do? You know, how do you... I mean, sometimes you'll also feel that you have to protect people from themselves. They'll say something to you that you know they don't realize would be extremely potent in print. And you have to make a decision, you know, and if they are not press savvy and they didn't say to you, that's off the record, you know, you have to decide in your own heart. Do you use it, or do you just think, no, I'm not going to? Do you intervene if you see something that's troubling? You know, I've only done that once, and I felt it was the right thing to do. But you know, you're still a human being, and that's where it gets complicated. It would be really nice if you weren't. You could just do this and sit down, write, you know, to hell with it, whatever happens. But that's definitely not. I mean, I hate when people hate what I've written. It's horrible. I mean, you just feel horrible. Even if you did it, you know, I mean, no matter what, it feels horrible. And sometimes you'll think people are going to like what you wrote, and they just will not. And you know, you can't anticipate it, which is probably the one helpful thing, because when you're writing, you won't know if somebody is going to react really negatively or positively. I wrote a profile once of, do you guys know the band The Bangles? Mm-hmm. So I'd written a profile of the Bangles, and I wrote a lot about the lead singer in a way that I thought was very unflattering, and kind of described her as arrogant and kind of bratty and difficult. And I thought, oh man, she's gonna just hate this, and that's the way it goes, you know, that's just, what are you gonna do? And she called me when the story came out, and she said, oh, I love the piece, I wanted to thank you, it was so great. Now, either it was brilliant PR on her part, where she thought, you know what, the best way to deal with this is just treat it like it's great. Or maybe she's so arrogant that she didn't notice that it was kind of critical. I don't know. But it was so disarming that I thought, oh my God, she's the greatest person in the world. I mean, God, it's incredible. So it was very, it worked well. And then I've written things that I thought people would really like, and they hated them. And that's just, you know, you can't anticipate it. Gar, I don't know, the mic there. Is it freezing in here? Oh. Yeah. And why don't I'll take your question, and then let's take a little break, and then we'll reconvene. Does that sound good? Yeah. Sort of break time, break master? Okay.
Like you said, I mean, 10 being a very interesting age, kind of one foot in one door, one foot in another. The topic of sex comes up. I was really interested by this, the section where they're talking about swimming class and what happened. And you know, you allude to sex earlier in the lead and throughout with these boys' relationships with the girls in their class. And you know, as you said, you don't really like to plan what you're going to write, but did you see this being something you kind of had to tackle, the topic of sex?
Yeah.
Was it a squeamish thing for you? How did you kind of approach it? How did you feel about it?
Well, I did feel, first of all, to be a woman writing about a little boy, it was just a natural, I mean, I think it would be interesting no matter what, because you see these adorable 10-year-olds, and, you know, they're already starting to think about boyfriends and girlfriends, and, I mean, now they would already be, like, hooking up at 10, but at that time, you know, they were it's a huge part of your life when you're 10, is becoming conscious of gender and, you know, who's cute and who's a boyfriend and girlfriend. So it just seems so natural. And I felt totally comfortable. I mean, maybe it's just me, but I found it just really fun to ask him about it. And I was really happy that he was pretty comfortable talking about girls and feelings about girls. And I didn't find it awkward to write about, because it was still so, it almost encapsulated the point of the story, which was this funny mixture of innocence and worldliness. And the fact that they were going to do sex ed that year, you know, that felt like, you know, this was an important piece of being 10. Was at the point where society has decided you better learn about sex. So it felt very easy. And, you know, I do get, not squeamish, but, you know, there's certain subjects that are kind of harder to talk about. I think with a 10-year-old that was easy because it was all very, it was still pretty much in this kind of crazy, wifty sort of misperception of what sex was all about. And to me, the ultimate comment was, the best thing about being married is you could sleep in your clothes. And I thought that was the absolute center of the story for me, that he could imagine being married, but he was still so innocent that the idea of like sex was, I mean, it was just like, wow, you could be grown up and you could sleep in your clothes, which is so much fun. And I thought, wow, what would it be like to be 10, you know, and have that as your goal? And it was really, that really was, if I were to point out, you know, someplace other than the lead where I was trying to really capture that, was, to me, that told you everything about the way he saw the world in this bridge between those two life stages. And he's right, that is the best thing about being married. So are we good for doing a quick break? And, you know, why don't we just, I never wear a watch anymore. Let's take it like a 10-minute break. So my first goal was to capture the feeling of being around a kid, not as an authority figure, teacher, or parent, but it seemed to me that that was an adventure that most adult readers would have never had. The most exotic story I've ever done, being inside the head of a 10-year-old. So that was sort of my first thing. Just, I'm going to take you on this adventure into his way of looking at the world. And then I had a few themes that began to emerge very powerfully. I mean, one is, as I said before, the trying to capture the balancing act of being 10 and being a child and starting to grow out of it. The poignancy of the very rapidly fading world of childhood. You know, that was another big theme that came to me. The, you know, just in concrete terms, what do kids think about? I mean, all this stuff about recycling and being, you know, money and all of these just concrete facts. This is what a kid at 10 thinks about. So that was another whole piece of the story. And because these pieces began to kind of make themselves known to me, I thought, all right, I'm going to be assembling chunk, you know, that kind of addresses piece here, this piece, that piece. Then I had all this reporting, and some of it just felt like I really wanted to include that, the balance between a very academic way of looking at kids versus the experiential way of hearing him and being in his world. Then there's just the writerly viewpoint, which is I want you to just sit down and hear my story for 45 minutes or however long it's going to take you, and just tell you about this interesting experience I just had, which is a theme, a very worthy theme that you sort of forget about, which is that you're sitting around telling someone an incredible story. If you were sitting at dinner and someone said to you, I just spent 2 weeks with a little kid, you'd probably say, you're kidding, what was that like? So I think that's a huge theme, which is just, I'm doing things that you're not likely to do because you're not living the life I'm living. And so it's a very worthy, legitimate theme to say, I'm going to now tell you about this experience I just had so you can feel what it was like and have a taste of it. So I think those things fit together nicely. And are we running out of time?
We're running out. I want to ask you one thing.
Okay.
Is
Okay.
there other questions? Anybody else? I would like you to talk a little bit about being a writer twittering. I'll tell you why I want you to talk about it, because I think this is an important subject for young aspiring creative writers and young journalists to think about repositioning themselves in this social media world. I don't think it comes naturally to everyone. I think some reason that some of us become writers is to hide behind that byline and not have to do that. Some of us aren't very opinionated. Some of us aren't writing haikus. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff going on here, and yet I can tell you that we do this series called Primary Sources, where we put together two figures in video, and we just put up Nora Ephron and Pete Hamill, and we put up Ted Conover and Ann Fadiman in QQAA. They're both asking each other questions.
Oh, cool.
And James McBride and Spike Lee will go up very shortly. And it's, getting some attention. Of course, we all Twitter it out and do all kinds of stuff with it. The one that has gone viral around the world is Jay Rosen and Clay Shirky. And I would say, with all due respect to two people I admire a lot, in the world at large, they do not have the audience or the standing of the other people I have just mentioned.
Right.
I think, wouldn't that be a fair statement?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But
And
they're
yet,
on.
in a social world,
Right.
it's like 0 to 1,000.
Right.
So this is a very interesting. Does this make sense to you? This is a very interesting shift that's happening. So
Huge.
What you could say is, this is another world. I was talking to Jane Berenson the other day, who said, Inc. has everything for free on the web. They don't care because it doesn't hurt their subscription audience. It's a different audience.
Right.
But these balances are really in flux right now. Things are changing at a
so
you're
much,
one
yeah.
of the few people in your universe who has gotten very aggressive, very proactive about this somewhat unseemly new world that everybody's tiptoeing into in a funny way.
Yeah.
And some of us do it sort of because we have to, and I think you've embraced it in a kind of funny and interesting and enjoyable way. And I wanted you to talk, and you did it early. You did it a little bit ahead of the curve. You were a little ahead of the curve. I remember the first time we talked about it when you said
Oh, really?
that you had gone on Facebook. I mean,
Yeah.
you were like about 6 months ahead of all of the people in our cohort. So
Yeah, isn't that
talk a
funny?
little bit about that.
Yeah.
Because I think people need to hear it.
And it is very funny. And boy, I just feel like it's a runaway train too. I mean, the sense of journalism.
And a real time suck.
Yeah, but it's also, I just feel like it's just, I've never seen anything happen so fast and so decisively. It's just very interesting. I joined Facebook originally with no intention of it being a public thing. It was just, I was going to be chatting with friends. So I never thought of it as social media in the bigger sense. And for a long time, that's what it was. And I kept a small group, and they were actually my friends. I joined Twitter at the urging of my assistant, who was much, much younger than me. I had never heard of Twitter. She said, you should do it. It's something that, is a good way to kind of be out there in touch with your audience. So I joined. I mean, anything free, I'll join, so why not? And for a long time, I didn't do anything. I mean, I don't even remember what I posted or why, and I couldn't figure it out, and I found it very puzzling, and I couldn't figure out how anyone found you or how you found people. It just seemed mysterious. And then I began tweeting a little bit more about writing, and then a little bit about just life, and And then for the first time I began noticing that people were following it, which is very different from when you're just writing into the void. It's funny, a huge difference where you start feeling that people are reading. Is it a time suck? Yeah. However, as I was pointing out the other day to somebody, I don't live in the city anymore. I would argue that I spend probably less time tweeting than I did when I was working at the New Yorker offices and we'd be sitting around, chatting. Secondly, I actually find the writing exercise challenging and interesting. How do you say something of some merit in this? Yeah. And also, how do you form a persona in this little fractured, rat-a-tat-tat way? It's a good challenge. I also feel, just looking forward and being absolutely self-protective. We're all going to be promoting our own books and work in the future, and if it gives me a connection to readers that I'm really in control of, my publisher isn't in control of, the magazine I write for isn't, it's my conversation with my readers, then I think that's a valuable thing. It's also, if you're not somebody who cranks out books and articles, which would be true of me, I feel like it's filling in the gap between the stories I'm writing. I had this conversation on Blogging Heads the other day with Kurt Anderson. I don't know if you saw it. So we were just talking. So we were talking about this very thing. I mean, is it a good thing to let people see the man behind the curtain? Does it affect your, is it more valuable to have a kind of slightly mysterious, facade that nobody knows a thing about your personal life? I don't know. I mean...
And then there's the self-promotional question also, I suppose, that you have to ask. I mean, in some ways, the holy grail is that other people are talking about your work and spreading it out there, that you're not doing it yourself. On the other hand, people seem to be very successful doing that.
I know, and I think people can do it too much. And there are people who all they're doing is saying, look at the good review I got here, look at the good review I got there, and you think, okay, it's enough already. I mean, and I don't do that much. I've mentioned when I'm going to do appearances, and I mention when I have stories that have come out.
Fair enough.
But I am very reluctant to blow my own horn. I mean, I feel there's just a tone that I don't like when I'm reading other people's, which might seem silly and false modesty, but I feel like I'm much happier if someone else can do that. But I do feel that building up an interest in what I'm doing as a writer is just self-preservation. I mean, and I feel lucky that I enjoy the form. I'm not sure that, I think a lot of people just would think, ugh, I hate doing this, or I don't want to write about, my husband, I've been bothering him to tweet because he has a book that just came out.
And he won't do it.
Well, he's just not comfortable. It's not his...
But he's a funny guy.
He's very funny, but it's just not natural for him. Now, I
can take the school's persona. I'm able to do that.
Right.
I do that with ease.
Well, and I got a lot more followers, weirdly enough, when I was writing about my chickens, and one of my chickens who got sick, and I had so many people following me. Now, whether they were following me because they already knew my work and found it interesting to see what my life was like, or whether they like chickens, or...
The mules are funny, the chickens are funny, and if you know you at all, it's preposterous.
Right.
The disconnect is so huge.
Yeah, and and then I've written a lot about writing, and I do think people, I don't feel it takes away from the end product to say, I'm working on a story about mules. I just was at mule camp. Post a picture of one of the mules. You know, honestly, I feel like it gets people ginned up so that when the story's out, they're prepared and they go see it. And I feel like, I think people like seeing the process. I'm now hesitant to write anything truly personal because now I have too many followers, so I wouldn't write, you know, had a fight with my husband. I mean, you know, I'm not sure I ever would, but I think I'm much more conscious of that now, and now that I've linked Facebook to it, and now I've let anyone who requests a friendship on Facebook, I've just gone ahead and done it because I don't feel that it's just my friends anymore. I feel actually lucky that I like the form. I mean, it's a little bit like how I used to feel that I was lucky that I liked doing readings. Because being a writer doesn't mean you enjoy doing public appearances. I felt lucky that I like doing public appearances, and it helped support my work as a writer, but they are not necessarily on the same chromosome puff, as they say, nor is tweeting, and that kind of relaxed, chatting, informal kind of conversation would be very unnatural, probably, for a certain kind of writer. So it's funny. I mean, I wouldn't have thought, gee, that's going to be kind of my medium, but who knows? I mean, I always thought that, wouldn't it be weird to find out, like on your deathbed, that you had a talent you knew nothing about? I mean, I always thought, what if I was a really good, you know, rugby player, and I never knew because I never played rugby. And this came up when, for a while, there were all these amazing African basketball players. And I thought, what if they had never seen a basketball? You know, Manute Bol, remember Manute Bol? You know, he was like a shepherd in Somalia or something. And somebody said, hey, try bouncing this. And he was incredibly good at it. So some of it is, you know, who knew? And I never thought I'd enjoy it or even feel that I was good at it for whatever. But I do feel like this is the future, whether it's Twitter or whether it's writers.
Google Buzz out today.
Is that?
It's a new form. Goodbye, Twitter. Yeah.
Really?
Something new has come out. We are so glad you shared your class with us.
Oh, well, thanks. Thank you, everybody.